You know, there's a lot of talk in the Texas deer industry about high fences. We just had a discussion over there about how some folks don't like high fences, and that's understandable, but high fences can be a very important tool in wildlife management. So today we're going to talk a little bit about high fencing, and we're going to talk about some of the reasons that people don't like high fencing, and also some of the reasons why it should be encouraged. It should be encouraged in the state of Texas. Why would a Texas landowner want to high fence their property? Well, you'll hear people say that there's constant scrutiny from traditionalists, folks that don't care for high fencing, folks that don't believe that the state's deer should be high fenced. Gary, front and center. You'll have people that say that high fenced deer are dirty deer, they're breeder deer, they all have CWD, they're all diseased deer. That it's not fair chase to hunt inside a high fence. Have you ever heard that? A lot of people hear that. That harvested animals are not eligible for entry into the Boone and Crockett Club, because we all want to get animals into the Boone and Crockett Club. There are some regulations and policies of the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department which can make it pretty difficult to manage deer inside high fence ranches. You'll hear people say that high fencing requires a massive investment of time and finances in order to maintain the deer herd that is inside the high fence. And you'll also hear that people say that a high fence deer is just not worth as much as a low fence deer. So let's try to dispel some of those rumors. Let's try to work through some of those problems that people have with high fences, and let's talk a little bit about it. So first and foremost, why would a landowner want to high fence their property? The first reason is because the average deer in the state of Texas, the average low fence deer in the state of Texas has 8 points and scores about 130 inches on the Boone and Crockett scale. And for a lot of people, that's a nice buck. But in today's management scheme in the state of Texas, 130-inch 8-point is probably a little under what most hunters and what most landowners and what most land managers are seeking for their properties. So its improvement of the deer herd is the chief reason that people high fence their properties. Because you're not going to live long enough to manage a 130-inch deer herd to a 170-inch deer herd. There's an old saying that you can't get blood out of a turnip. Deer genetics are consistent. You have what you have, and if you capture a population inside a high fence, or you manage a population outside a high fence, you will find that it's very difficult without a lot of expense and without a lot of time to manage that deer herd from 130-inch average to 170-inch average, especially if you're hoping to harvest some of those animals on the upper end of that scale. Over the course of time, if you manage a property and you only harvest the lower end of the bell curve of the population, yes, you will gradually improve that property, but it could take years, it could take decades to make those kinds of things happen. And most landowners don't have the patience or persistence to be able to wait long enough to see those improvements come to fruition. Because Texas is 97% private land, the lack of large acreage tracts of public land make it really difficult to manage deer populations on a scale. In the western part of the United States, you have literally millions of acres that are contiguous tracts of wildlife country, and state agencies are able to manage those deer populations more effectively. In Texas, with 97% private land ownership, you have properties getting smaller and smaller and smaller over time as properties sell and divide, or as landowners pass away and those properties are divided amongst their heirs. So you see what's called land fragmentation, which is those properties getting smaller and smaller and smaller. It's hard. It's hard to manage those properties together in a large acreage where you can manage an entire population. Now, cooperative efforts of trying to get landowners together and gather small acreage properties together and improve the management strategy, those efforts certainly work, and they've been shown to work, especially in East Texas and other areas where you have some larger acreage country that you add together and make a larger property. But it's to a point. It's to a point. You also see antler restrictions that have increased the number of mature bucks available, but not necessarily increased the quality of bucks available. And you've always got that one person, that one neighbor, where you guys are working together and you've got this great plan and everything's going great, but you've got that one neighbor over there that's just not participating in the co-op. And all that hard work that you put together to try to manage those animals up and make them larger and try to get mature animals, and he puts his corn feeder 100 yards from the fence line. Right? Makes it difficult. Also, you have to understand that with private land ownership, as high as it is in the state of Texas, private landowners want to get a return on the investment that they put in their properties, whether they're investing in traditional livestock. So I go buy cows. I'm not buying cows to improve the grass on my property. I'm buying cows to sell the calves or to sell pairs in the future. I want a return on my investment. And wildlife is the same way, or it should be the same way. Private investment is good for all wildlife. Private investment in Texas wildlife, including high fencing, leads to wildlife and habitat conservation. I want you to think about that. Okay, take a 200-acre property. A 200-acre property in Live Oak County, Texas. Is that property going to be a cattle ranch where it is managed, sculpted, brush taken off to effectively manage and get a return on cows? Open country, grassland, not a lot of wildlife habitat there, is there? Or is it going to be high fenced, okay, and managed as a deer population? And that deer population and the investments that landowner puts into that population doesn't just benefit the deer population, it benefits all wildlife populations on that property. And if you take that small scale and you replicate it all over the state of Texas, small landowners are actually contributing to wildlife population and habitat conservation. And really, that's something I want to make sure that everybody understands. High fencing leads to wildlife conservation, okay? Discouragement of private investment in wildlife resources by government policies or by private financial agendas will ultimately lead to habitat destruction and resource diminishment. And what I mean by that is that because small landowners can manage on a more intensive scale on their properties, a lot of large acreage property owners don't like that because it creates potentially a financial competition to their hunting operations or their leasing operations or whatever they're doing on a large acreage, large scale management, because they have that greater acreage to manage. If the agenda of those larger landowners, or if the policies of our government agencies are set to discourage the gentleman right here from high fencing his property, that is discouraging wildlife and habitat conservation, okay, instead of encouraging it. Landowners can't be expected to provide investment in their properties for the benefit of wildlife only on a philanthropic basis. And why is that? Because not every Texan is a billionaire, right? I'm certainly not a billionaire. I certainly don't own, manage, or have an investment in a 20,000, 100,000, 300,000 acre piece of property. I don't have that luxury, okay? But I still want to manage wildlife. I want to manage wildlife on my property. You know, prior to the advent of intensive deer management, which was really brought on in the 1980s and 1990s by organizations like Texas Trophy Hunters and the Texas Deer Association, most of the larger antlered or pockets of antler genetics in the state of Texas were on large acreage properties, okay, where those landowners could manage on scale and could sell leasing spots or commercial hunting spots to the highest bidder across the state of Texas. The ability of small acreage property owners to go out and manage their properties, just like we talked about, has taken some of those opportunities away from those larger scale landowners. So the guy that now has 200 acres, he may be able to manage his 200 acres and through intensive deer management and proper habitat management actually get a larger, let's say, comparable antler quality on his property as one of those 200,000 acre landowners has on their own. Competition, financial competition. Because a 170-inch deer eats the same amount as a 130-inch deer. We've got Purina here today, and we appreciate their sponsorship of the event. You have to understand that any kind of investment that you put into wildlife resources, let's say it's food plots, let's say it's improving wildlife habitat, let's say that you have roller chopped 100 acres on your property. Those kinds of investments create, and supplemental feeding, create wonderful opportunities for deer to maximize their genetic potential. Good fences make good neighbors. You know, the material quality of high fences that are being utilized now, they create a boundary between you and your neighbor which lasts for decades, okay? And we all have neighbors on our properties. I'll specifically say that I have some very, very good neighbors. And I also have one or two neighbors which I really don't care for. And I love the fact that my high fence is between me and that neighbor that I don't care for. It makes me much more comfortable having that neighbor next door to me. You know, a properly installed high fence can be an effective tool also for controlling unwanted predators, whether you're snaring for coyotes or bobcats or varmints or anything else. And it also allows you to control feral species, feral hogs, etc., on your property and try to reduce the damage that those animals are causing to your wildlife habitat and to your wildlife populations. And also, we were talking about the one guy that's not exactly on the same plan as you. A really nice high fence, it sure does reduce the property disputes with the buck that jumped over the fence. So good fences make good neighbors. So let's talk about dirty deer. Let's talk about CWD just a little bit, and I want to try to give you some of my experiences over the last couple of years with CWD. You know, the discovery of CWD in a deer breeding facility in 2015 caused a massive reaction by the state game agencies. They implemented new policies, new regulations, which vastly increased the testing of CWD amongst both breeder populations and high-fenced populations. So for breeder populations, understand that at the beginning, thousands of deer were euthanized in order to assure that deer that had direct traces from the source facility were not affected. Okay, that's number one. Number two, deer that had been sold to high-fence ranches, release sites, were being tested on a more consistent basis, and regulations were put into place to check for CWD on release sites. I'll also say that the minimum testing requirements of a breeder facility were raised from 20% to 80% of adult mortalities. we as an industry working with the state game agencies helped implement new policies of live testing for CWD. Most CWD testing is done post-mortem on dead deer. But we implemented new policies and developed new procedures for live testing on deer. And tens of thousands of deer and breeder pens were tested for CWD. So what was the result of all this testing? This massive increase of testing? Well, first of all, what it showed is only 5 breeding facilities in the state of Texas have tested positive for CWD, just 5. At the time that the first incident of CWD was discovered in a breeding facility, there were about 1,300 breeding facilities. There's a few less than that now, but what that means is that less than 1/2 of 1%, not even 1% of breeding facilities were affected, okay? Every single one of those breeding facilities was connected or is connected either by traceability. I sold a deer to Gary. I sold a deer to so-and-so. That's traceability, okay? Or geographic proximity. And it's a very small area of geographic proximity. So what that's told us is that CWD in Texas is very, very limited in high fences. Very, very limited to an nth degree in breeding facilities. Now, one of the interesting things that some of the testing that has provided us is there's been some low fence deer, okay, which have tested positive for CWD in the state of Texas in 3 geographical regions without a whole lot of testing done. So one of the things that really needs some additional research and some additional testing is testing of low fence populations, because it's really not clear to us at this point what the prevalence is amongst low fence animals versus the very well-tested, proven, okay, CWD clean breeder herds. I think what I would circle back to with regards to high fencing, it allows private landowners in the state of Texas to seek a return on their investment. The ability to recover the costs of, let's say, drilling a water well or that roller chopping that we talked about. The ability of a landowner to recover costs either by, let's say, selling commercial hunting packages or leasing opportunities with greater quality animals. If the landowner has the opportunity to recover those costs by increased income from ecotourism or recreational tourism, they're going to go invest more. It incentivizes private landowners to invest more in wildlife management on their properties. High fences are a very important part of encouraging private landowners in Texas to invest in wildlife habitat and wildlife conservation. Do big deer sell ranches? Okay. Mark's a real estate guy, and he'll tell you every day of the week and twice on Tuesday that a ranch with big deer, well-managed deer, is going to sell quicker and for a higher value than a ranch that has not been managed. So high fences and managing deer also help create greater value for land. Ultimately, the goal for all wildlife enthusiasts should be to enhance wildlife conservation across the country. That all is in caps. Even the haters, even the people that say there should be no high fences, should be able to recognize the benefits to wildlife populations and wildlife habitat that high fences can create. In Texas, with a majority of private land ownership and increasingly smaller properties, the incentive of financial return on a wildlife investment is essential to improve wildlife conservation and should be encouraged.